Good evening, everyone. Welcome to your library at home. My name is Rebecca. I'm the Acting Public Programs Manager at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that I live and work and am speaking to you tonight on Gadigal land, the traditional custodians of this land on which knowledge has been exchanged for millennia. We also celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal culture and language across New South Wales, and I take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and especially emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us online this evening. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to a very special author talk, where we will shortly be welcoming to your screens Bernadette Brennan in conversation with Susan Wyndham, as they celebrate Bernadette's latest release, Leaping into Waterfalls, a meticulous and moving biography of the life and work of Gillian Mears. Before I hand over to our speakers tonight, a quick reminder that we are taking questions at the conclusion of tonight's discussion. I urge you to send through any questions at any stage using the Q&A feature of your Zoom app, where Susan will kindly moderate as many questions as she can at the conclusion of her discussion with Bernadette. It gives me great pleasure now to welcome to your screens, Susan and Bernadette.
Hello.
Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Rebecca. Hi, Bernadette.
Hello, Susan. Hello, audience.
Hello, audience.
Wherever you may be.
It's my very great pleasure to be here with Bernadette Brennan for the launch of her brilliant biography of Gillian Mears, Leaping into Waterfalls, the enigmatic Gillian Mears, who was one of the most fascinating and indeed enigmatic of recent Australian writers. Welcome especially to Gillian's family members, friends, and others who've loved her, and welcome to everyone who loves her books or wants to discover them, because I'm sure that this biography is going to spark a new generation of interest in Gillian's work, and I hope some new editions of her books. Bernadette Brennan left her academic career just a few years ago to become a full-time writer, and she's made very good use of her time. She remains a widely published literary critic and is on the judging panel for the Miles Franklin Literary Award. Her much acclaimed biography, A Writing Life, Helen Garner and Her Work, was published in 2017. Garner gave her special access to her treasure trove of letters and diaries in the National Library, and Bernadette proved her ability to show where fact and fiction intersect and diverge in the work of an author who draws deeply on her own life. All of that helped her prepare for the challenge of an even more complex and well-documented life. Gillian Mears was born in 1964 in northern New South Wales, where she lived a lot of her life, and she died there in 2016, shortly before her 52nd birthday, after suffering for many years from multiple sclerosis. Into that short life, she packed several lifetimes worth of creativity, adventure, passion, and suffering. And she recorded every day, every thought, every feeling in her diaries, letters, and in different ways in her writing. Gillian's published books included 2 collections of short stories, Ride a Cock Horse in 1988 and A Map of the Gardens, 2002, 3 novels, The Mint Lawn, 1991, The Grass Sister, 1995, and Fallsbread, 2011, as well as many other stories, essays, poems, and a children's book, The Cat with the Coloured Tail, in 2015. She received high praise and awards from the beginning, and Fallsbread won 5 major awards, including the Prime Minister's Literary Award for Fiction, which she joyfully received from Julia Gillard in 2012. We can only imagine and mourn what she might have achieved if she had lived longer. I just want to add on a personal note that I met Gillian really for the first time when I interviewed her about The Cat with the Coloured Tail. And although she was very unwell by that time, she charmed and entertained me for an afternoon. And when she found out I had a cat, she wrote to me with one of her precious cats with a coloured tail that a friend had made in connection with the book. And I thought he should be our mascot for tonight. So here's to Gillian. One of those
Susan,
beautiful
that
cats.
is extraordinary. Gillian was so happy to see that cat there. Oh, wow. Fantastic.
So Bernadette, congratulations and thank you for your very important and totally absorbing biography, which is already impressing reviewers and everyone who's reading it. Now, it's 4 years since you published the Helen Garner biography, which doesn't seem very long. When and why did you decide that Gillian Mears would be your next subject? Was she an author who had interested you?
No, not particularly. I'll just start also just acknowledging that I'm speaking to people from Gadigal land and also pay my respects to elders past and present and any First Nations viewers out there tonight and who may see this in the future. Unceded Gadigal land, I should say. Yeah, so I finished the Garner book and it was so much fun just working in an archive and then somehow weaving a story together of a version of someone's life or writing that I thought I really would like to do this one more time. And I was casting around for who I might do, and I wanted to do an Australian female writer because the way the publishing industry goes, writers are forgotten all too soon, their books are out of print all too soon. And so I was thinking, now who is of a sufficient interest in their life, plus also a good enough writer to capture my imagination? And I started reading around and then I thought, Gillian Mears is very interesting. And that essay she wrote about being alive in Anton B, I just thought was the most extraordinary essay I'd read. And I thought, I'll just go back and reread her books. And I started doing that. And I actually met Michelle de Kretzer for a cup of coffee. And she said, listen, have you thought of doing Gillian Mears? And I said, oh, I'm just rereading The Grass Sister. And she said, I think she's got a couple of scrapbooks in the State Library. I said, oh, I'll have a look. And then that couple of scrapbooks, of course, turned out to be 154 boxes and thousands of hours of all sorts of things in that archive. And there I was hooked.
Well, I want to go into that archive with you. But first of all, I just wanted to set up Gillian as your subject. You write in the book that she was one of the most important Australian female writers of the last 40 years. And it's obvious she won prizes and was widely admired. But what for you makes her so important about her writing?
I think her talent makes her so important. I think to be able to read a paragraph or a sentence again and again and think, how did you do that? How did you actually get us to feel what you are describing there? I also thought she was extremely important because she wrote about female experience, female desire, unfiltered often, the way she wrote about such things. But she wrote about country towns. She wrote about the lack of opportunity for women at this particular time. She wrote into a history of access, if you like, having had their way paved by people like Garner, Thea Astley, Kate Grenville. Beverly Farmer sort of was at the end of that sort of group there, and Gillian was coming along. So she picked up a kind of tradition that said, I'm actually going to write about female experience and domesticity, if you like, in a way that speaks to readers. She also had a grave disability and she wrote about that fearlessly. So I thought she's so important because she covered so many different aspects of experience in Australian life. And she was a great writer. So that was enough for me.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as you say, you discovered that her archive was the second largest in the New South Wales State Library after the Fairfax Media Company. When did you actually discover this and how did you then tackle it?
Okay, so I first went on the website and had a look and thought, oh, there seems to be quite a bit of Gillian Mears papers there in the State Library. But the first thing I had to do was I contacted Gabby Nair, who is Gillian's agent and very close friend, and said, I'm thinking of doing this biography. Gabby was very cautious, saying that's great. I applaud that, but I think it's still very raw for the family. Gillian had only been dead less than 2 years, and it still is raw, but it was very soon. So she suggested I contact the family first and see if I could get their permission to write this biography. And I also had to contact the archivists at the State Library to say, what are the conditions of access? There were some which were not spelt out. And that's when I was told very early on, before I'd even met Gillian's family, I was told there was a group of 5 archivists who sat me down and took such care with this archive, because just about everybody that's spoken about in it and written about in it is still living. And Gillian did write down everything. So they were very wary of, where is my research going? What is my intention? What am I going to look at? What am I not going to look at? There are some specific caveats for not being allowed to look at certain people's letters, those sorts of things. And it was then at that meeting that one of them said to me, look, I think it's second in size only to the Fairfax archive. Now, since then, I've talked to Kathy Perkins and she was saying, we're not exactly sure if that's true. It's certainly the very biggest literary archive we've got, but it's probably true, but it might not be true, but it's certainly huge. So I knew that from the outset, and that just made me happy at that time. I just thought, oh, this is fantastic. Now I've got something to work with. I've got a great writer. The little bit I know about her life is really interesting. And now I've got this huge archive. Let me at it.
So give us an idea of what you found in there and some of the surprises or highlights.
Okay, so Gillian kept just about every piece of paper she came across and wrote on from the age of, sometimes there's some birthday cards from when she was 5, but there's a lot of other stuff from the time she was 7. And so there's an awful lot in the archive, which is birthday cards, letters to her parents, cards from her nieces and nephews. She was a very devoted aunt, and there's lots and lots of paintings by all these kids who are now adults and parents themselves. But there were this extraordinary number of letters, thousands and thousands and thousands of letters. And they were to people like Gerald Murnane, Helen Garner, Kate Grenville, Drusilla Majeska, Tom Carment, Marg Rounds. This whole cultural life of Australia was encapsulated, if you like, in this correspondence.
And I think she kept copies of her own letters, is that right?
She kept copies of some, but not all.
Right.
And then to some certain people, sometimes just her sisters, but sometimes other writers, she would send them stamped self-addressed envelopes at the end of the year and say, listen, just send them back to me because they're important for the historical record. Now, I think at one point she was thinking, yes, I'm building a great archive. But also at that time, when she was in her early 20s, she and her then husband used to read letters and send letters as relaxation. This was something we did for entertainment. And so they would get, sometimes when they were traveling, 50, 60 letters a day that would come in, and that would be their entertainment. So it's an old-fashioned kind of entertainment. But so that was surprising. The diaries were extremely surprising because sometimes Gillian kept three at a time, and sometimes 30 pages a day. How you keep that amount of diary, plus write short stories or novels, plus write this correspondence, just blew my mind. I thought this woman was a powerhouse of writing and recording. And there's also things like, there's lots and lots of flowers in there. There's bits from the garden. There's when Bruce Pascoe sent her some dingo fur and some bird feathers. They're in there. There's the ALS gold medal she won. That's in there. The Colin Roderick's medals in there. Everything basically that she touched or owned is in there, as well as thousands of text messages and emails, which became a little bit oppressive at times, I have to admit.
It's a gift and something of a burden, isn't it, to have so much material?
It is. And it was nice what you said in the introduction that my work on the Garner archive got me ready for this one. It really did. This time, it was the second time going through a big archive, and I knew what was going to make story. And so I had my laptop and I'd type away and put everything in. Although when I got to the end of the archive in the first going through it, I had 300,000 words of essential words on my laptop. So it needed a little bit of a trim. But yes, so it was great. And a lot of the time it was just fantastic. I really wasn't interested in the rest of the world. I just wanted to go into the State Library and have my 7 or 8 hours with this archive and then come out and look at the domain and move my body again and walk my dog and think that the world came back. But there were also times when Gillian recorded so much at periods when she was extremely feeling the darkness extremely. And that got into my soul. It actually really affected me at times. And I found that very hard. But, you know, it was a challenge. And I think in the end, I had no idea if I could pull it off. I refused to sign a contract with different publishers who wanted to publish because I just didn't know if I could make this happen. And fortunately, I'd been awarded the Copyright Agency Cultural Funds Fellowship. And so I had this sense of, well, I have to make this happen because I have to fulfill my obligation. And in the end, I think somehow I managed.
Well, you certainly did. And you seem to have done it remarkably quickly. I thought you'd be in there drowning for many more years, but you were extremely efficient. And of course, you've also done an enormous number of interviews and traveling around the country. How did COVID affect your work on this? Did it stop you from doing anything or change your direction?
There were a couple of people that I would have interviewed and sat down and interviewed, which I could not do. I just couldn't get to them across the borders at different times. I would not have got it written if it wasn't in the end for COVID, because it actually gave me permission. I had spent a year of 5 to 5.5 days a week in the State Library taking these notes. I had so much to do. I had to work out some kind of structure and how I was going to do this. And then, of course, COVID came along and I was allowed to withdraw from the world, if you like. So I was one of those very lucky writers who could afford to withdraw from the world, had an office to work in, was not homeschooling, and I could simply focus on the writing, which is, I've got to say, something I've aspired to do for about 30 years. So for the first part of that was great. In terms of travelling, we got to the point where whenever borders were open, or New South Wales was open for a lot of the time, and there would be people that would say, yes, I'm available to meet you or talk with you. And I'd jump in the car actually with my husband, Justin. He'd say, right, I'm off on a road trip. And off we went to the Northern Rivers district, down south to Marimbula, to Mar Grounds' house. We met Marina Ellie Grounds. We went all around the place. And then at different times, the border for Queensland was open for 6 days. So within 24 hours, we're in the car and we're up to Queensland, spent a few hours there and then got back across the border to New South Wales and it shut again. So there was some great moments of just getting there in time, but it was also kind of exciting.
Yeah, well, you seem to have timed it pretty well. So obviously you had all this material. You had a full version of Gillian's life from her, but how much could you rely on that? And how many contradictory versions of her life did you end up with after talking to the many people you did?
I don't know that there was too many contradictory versions, but there was certainly a version of a very contradictory person. So I think what happens for me when I write these books, and I mean the Garner book and then this book, over time and being immersed in someone's writing as well as their private writing, their public writing and their private writing, one learns to, well, I learn to sort of immerse myself in their life, their personality, who they are. And these people start to live with you. So I sort of just got to know this Gillian very, very deeply. And I wasn't sure if I was going to get there. With Helen Garner, it was easier because she was alive. And I did get to know Helen so well, but Gillian wasn't. But I think she left enough for me to go on. And then the interviews with all her friends and families and lovers and therapists and peers added to that. You asked about how reliable it was. We're all fallible with our memories, aren't we? And we all tell a story, and we all tell the story from our perspective. And so I think probably Gillian's diaries were, as a diary, were largely for private reading, except she was always aware that someone was going to come along and read them, and kept addressing her biographers. By the way, biographer, you might like to read this. Or she would fill up diaries with large amounts of stuff that I'd think, okay, I'm not going there. This is something I don't want to deal with. And she'd say at the end of it, so, scholar of the future, the reason I've written this is because I think it's really important for you to deal with, and that's where you'll understand me. And I'm like, oh, Gillian, you're messing with my head. But there were some times when there were contradictory stories given to me from other people, and it allowed me to see what Gillian was feeling and thinking, what the other people were feeling and thinking, and that's life. That's how we all go. There's one funny story, Susan. It's a weird thing when you're working in an archive and you find yourself in it. And I remember with the Ghana one, suddenly there was a letter from me in there or something. It's embarrassing for me. I said, oh, what's this? And I met Gillian only the once, and it was to award her the ALS Gold Medal for Foals Bread. And there was a lot of correspondence between us at the time. And it was, would I post this to her? She was moving to Sydney. No, she'd like to meet for coffee. Okay, we'll meet for coffee. It went on and on. Anyway, she's then writing emails to Jane Polfreman saying, oh, this person, Bernadette Brennan, she's like a stalker. She's so desperate to meet me. And I'm thinking, well, no, I wasn't actually. And then we did meet, and we had a couple of coffees and a muffin each, and we chatted for a couple of hours. And in the archive, she has the medal with a little sticker on it saying, I wish I had received this at a time when I had my friends' caffeine and sugar, because I didn't. And I think, well, yes, you did. So those little moments, that's an anecdote, and it's not really important, but it is important for me to see it and think, well, actually, I know that's not true. And actually the emails prove it's not true also. But that's something to be aware of when you're taking your story from diaries and letters. I think when there's enough of a body of evidence, and there's enough interviews, and there's enough letters, then you can come up with a fairly secure story. Which is what I did.
Okay. You write in the book, so porous were the boundaries between her life and fiction that during the course of my research, I often became confused. Had I read about certain events or conversations in a story, novel, letter, or diary, or versions of them in all four? And I'd like to talk a bit about that overlap between the life and the writing, which is so much a feature of Gillian and which you handle so well. It's a very intricate, delicate process. So much of her writing, you say, was fueled by her attempt to understand her family and her place in it. Could you tell us about that big, larger-than-life family and her place in it?
Okay, so the Mears family, Peter Mears is the father and Sheila is Gillian's mother. Each of them had very interesting, fascinating childhoods, and I'll leave people to read about them in the book so we don't take up too much time here. But each had very problematic relationships with their mothers, and they came to Australia when the eldest child, Yvonne, was nearly 2 months old. They'd come from Rhodesia. And they settled in Binalabar outside of Lismore. And Peter and Sheila wanted to have a large family, and they wanted to bring them up with all the love and security that they perhaps had lacked themselves in their, they were each, Peter was an only child and Sheila had a brother. So they had 4 children in 5 years. They were all girls, or 5 and a bit years. And these kids grew up in this most extraordinary landscape. And Sheila was very cultured. She'd loved being in London and going to the music halls of London, and she was very musical and she loved language. So she instilled in these 4 kids their love of language, the love of the arts, the love of music. Peter was a grass scientist, and he introduced them to the beauty and the wonder of the outdoors. So they had this almost perfect combination, if you like. Peter's also a very talented watercolorist, as is Yvonne. So there's a strong creative streak through the family. And these 4 little girls grew up with their parents, and they were each other's best friends and soulmates, and lived this country existence. And there was a group of 6 families. One of them, Alison Gibbs's family, she's an author, and Lois Randall, who's a producer, their families, they were part of this naturalist field club. And these families used to go camping together in Binnaburra National Park or at Diggers Camp and in the different Lamington National Plateau. So these kids grew up with joy and love and the outdoors, but also literature and music and painting and ideas. And Gillian was the third of the 4. Yvonne and Karen were older than her. And by the time she was 2 and a bit, she was still walking on her bottom. She hadn't decided to walk yet, and she hadn't spoken. And her parents took her to the paediatrician saying, is there something desperately wrong with our daughter? And the paediatrician just said, no, her sisters intuit everything she needs. And, she kind of had them around her finger a little bit. So she became known as the sort of watcher. She was quiet in the family. And Sonia, who came after Gillian, was the extrovert, the youngest child who was, full of joy and extroversion. And Gillian was the quiet one and the watcher. And I think she was particularly sensitive. That idea of being porous in the boundaries, part of it is Susan Hanson, Drusilla Majeska, Ramona Koval, all in different interviews described her in almost identical language as saying she was skinless. There was this sense that she was open to the energies of the world in this intense way. She then went on to write about her sisters, her family, her parents, her mother, her love life, in a way that seemed to have no boundaries. And yet she turned it into art. So there's all sorts of, these complex contradictions that are going on here.
Yes.
It's a long way of answering your question because there's so much in it.
No, there's a lot more there to be.
There's a lot more in it. One thing that's interesting, it really worried me about, I never thought of myself as a biographer and didn't think I'd do this. And this idea that one takes a writer's work and then just reads it in a biographical framework, I think is reductive. But when you have a writer like Garner is and like Mears was, that says, I'm using my personal life to turn it into art and to write it as art, then it opens up this question of how do you negotiate the difference between the lived reality and the art. I didn't know much about Gillian's life other than that she had some sisters. I think I knew that. And she came from the Northern Rivers district and that she had MS. But I had read all her work. And I think that's amazing to then go back and reread something like The Grass Sister and gasp at how incredibly close it is to her actual life and the conversations that were had in her life and the things that were written in letters, and think, how on earth, firstly, did you have no filters and put this in? But also, you wrote this and I didn't know anything about your life and I thought it was a great book. So it is actually art. It's not actually just...
What is it that she does to transform it into art? Because most readers would have no idea how autobiographical it would be. And of course, many authors do the same, but perhaps not always to the same extent. So what is the border between the autobiography and this art that she has created?
I think it's actually a really deep thought that she has examined and re-examined and dug down into her own experience and her own thoughts and her own insecurities and written about them, but in such a way that they are the insecurities and the thoughts and the feelings and experiences of other women her age, other sisters her age, other daughters her age, country kids her age. So what she writes are stories about human fallibility and about desire and about death and loss and trauma. And yes, she's drawn on her own life, but she's turned them into stories that are for all of us to read. That's, I think, where the art comes in. So that was the line.
The language, the imagery,
Yeah.
The way she makes us experience it, it truly is art.
Yeah.
However, as you write in the biography, Gillian did upset many of the people she loved most by using their lives in her writing, by selling their letters to the library when she needed money often and for her archive. And her sister Yvonne also felt betrayed as one writer by another, because Gillian, she felt, had taken some of her material. Seems very clear that she did, whether she deliberately did it or not. But there were all these layers of betrayal and yet intense love at the same time. Excuse me. Sorry. And I just wondered how you approached the ethics of telling these people's stories again. They've already felt sort of breached, and now you're telling it all again. How did you deal with the delicacies of that and yet still tell the full story you wanted to tell?
Yeah, there's a couple of answers to that. Firstly, it helps being older, and it helps having had a few life experiences, and it helps accepting that we're all very flawed, and that we may all still love each other and love our siblings and love our ex-partners and still cause great damage. The other thing I did was Gillian was very interested in archaeology, and so I took, and she called her writing a careful archaeology. So I took that as my metaphor for my method and thought, what I'm doing here is excavating down into a woman's life, which involves the lives of her lovers, family, friends, peers, most of whom who are still living, many of whom who have actually been wounded by her writing already. So I thought I will deal with the relationships and the difficult relationships of which she has written, if it helps you understand her writing and what her actions might be. There are aspects to this story that I have not dealt with, and I'm quite happy that I haven't dealt with them. They're not mine to tell. They're her sisters to tell. They're her family's to tell. They're other people's to tell. They're not for a general reader to appreciate Gillian Mears's life and books. So I think I just use my own ethical radar. I think that's the line I'm not going to cross. That's not going in. This is going in. This is really helpful, so that goes in. This one doesn't. That sort of thing. I think that helps. In terms of people being written about before, there's a couple of things there. Firstly, the pain of Gillian's death is still so very real. And of course, in publishing this biography, it's a celebration of Gillian and her writing, and that's hopefully a very good thing for her family. But it also churns up a lot of emotions which have always been there, but are still very raw in the family. So I had to be as aware of that as I could be. With things, for example, like her husband, she wrote about a character in The Mint Lawn that was excoriating. It was just a cruel, cruel depiction of a person to whom she gave a number of characteristics that seemed to suggest she was writing about her husband. And there's been a lot written about that. Now, my attitude to that was, that's done. I'm not going there. I really don't want to re-wound there. That's not of any business. I will deal with the Mint Lawn in a different way. With Gillian's sisters, I wrote about what needed to be written about to understand why she published certain essays or why she published certain stories or what was driving her. In the end, of course, there was ferocious love. It never ended between all of them. But there is also intense pain. That's families, that's life, that's what we deal with.
She went naked in every way in her life and in her writing. Did you also feel you had to protect her from her own unfiltered writing? Did you feel, oh, Gillian,
no,
you shouldn't be showing that to the world, or was that not a consideration?
No, actually, I didn't feel that with Gillian, because I think what I got from her, from studying her work and her archive and her writing, was that she wanted it out there. And she would have said, go for it. Please adore me, and please, say I'm wonderful, and please say good things about me, because I really want you to tell this particular story. But she was a fierce one for honesty and truth. And the older she got, the more vehemently she said, I must be honest. I must tell my own truths about me and about everybody around me, which is what caused problems to other people in their lives. So I didn't feel I had to protect her, because she'd actually gone and put it all out there. But I wasn't interested in judging her either, because I just think she was just extremely interesting and complex.
Yes.
And I came to really respect her and like her. And I wrote this partly as in honor of her memory, in a celebration of her work, but in honor of her memory, and as a way of saying you matter, and you won't be forgotten in that kind of way.
Yeah. You don't really pass judgment. I thought you handled it very well. There must have been times you'd want to say, oh, Gillian, or yes, Gillian, you're brilliant, or you seem to me to walk a very careful line, not at all in a a contrived way, but you just simply present her in her complexity. And I wondered if that was a deliberate approach or a difficult approach at some time.
No, I didn't find it difficult. I don't feel the need to judge or say, this is right or wrong, or this was terrible or whatever. But I did think it was a deliberate approach. It was I was incredibly lucky to be edited by Meredith Rose, who had also edited Gillian for Paradise as a Place, and also for her Ant and Bee essay. And there were quite a few points when the manuscript came back when Meredith said, oh, no, we need your comment here. This is one of those terrible moments, or this is an aha moment, or this is, what do you feel about this? And I thought about that long and hard and thought, no, I don't need to do that, because I don't want to do that, because it sounds weird to say. I am the author of the biography, but the biography is not actually about me. So it was about Gillian, and it's about her work. And so I figured what I've chosen to put in is enough of my opinion or judgment. So I don't need to come down with, look, I think this is right, or that's wrong, or this is what she did, or that's ridiculous, or something. It's in there, and I've used as much as possible her writing or her words to map the story. And it didn't need me to interfere. I didn't want to put myself in there. I thought, no, step back, because I really genuinely believe that biography is not about the biographer. It's not about me. Although it is, because my personality writes this kind of book. But that's all it needs to be.
You found that you were writing not only a biography of a joyful and exuberant and adventurous life, but for half the life, really, at least, Gillian was unwell with various dramatic illnesses, and then her long decline with multiple sclerosis. It's a complicated theme in her writing as well. And of course, it was fascinating. She traveled in her old ambulance, Ant and Bee. She sought alternative treatments, including visiting a shaman on a mountain in Venezuela. It's fascinating material. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about how she used her illnesses and how she transcended them, because she was writing beautifully and efficiently, even when she was very unwell. How did that work its way into her writing?
Well, the most significant change in her writing came, I think, with Map of the Gardens, which is the collection of short stories published in 2002. And that 3 stories were written before 1999, but the rest of them were written after 1999, when Gillian at that point was very unsteady on her feet. She could barely walk. She had all sorts of conventional Western diagnoses, and she was looking for something else. She was looking for some kind of healing. And I'll just jump back a little bit to that diagnosis that she had been given. So she had all sorts of numbness happening in her body, and her ataxia was extreme. She saw a couple of different neurologists, and two of them said, look, you've got a problem in the disc in your cervical spine, and it's probably from an old fracture when you fell from a horse. And what we need to do is we need to drill a cage through the front of your vertebrae and take some of the pressure off the nerves at the back, and we're going to put this carbon fiber cage in your neck. Oh. And it was a little bit extreme. And then she went for another opinion, and the doctor said, yes, look, I think that's right, but I think we should put it off for a little bit. She wasn't convinced, thank goodness. She then met a woman who had actually had that surgery, and then that woman was in permanent pain and on massive doses of morphine. So Gillian took all her scans, buried them under a pumpkin patch, said, that's it, I'm done with Western medicine. 2 years earlier, she had also split up with, arguably, I think, the love of her life, a woman who was a farrier. And she had promised herself in her brokenheartedness that she would not have a relationship for 2 years until her body was recovered and she found herself again. So the 2 years is coming up, and she's really getting a bit antsy, and she's looking at all sorts of people for a relationship. She's suggesting it to all sorts of people. And then into the environment centre where she's working in Grafton comes a man who, by the name of Jeff, who had been working as a shiatsu healer in Sydney and had got burnt out and had gone out into the desert, and then come back and bought a farm at Nimboida, 50 k's out of 50 k's out of Grafton, and was living a lifestyle of meditation, shiatsu, yoga, macrobiotic lifestyle, which appealed hugely to Gillian. So Gillian took off out to Nimboida, and she lived with Jeff for a few years. She wrote a lot of those stories while she was there. And you say she was naked. She used to go on retreats up the back land, as she called it, and live naked for 10 days, playing her flute and cracking whips and convincing herself that she was feeling stronger. She had been addicted to sugar and caffeine, but sugar all of her life, and she was convinced that she was finally shedding the toxins in her body. So as her body got more and more unstable and she became more and more ill, she was convinced that she was doing a good thing. She wrote a number of stories at that time where the body is front and center, and it's the body that is decaying. It's the body that no longer can cope. And it's also the hubris of the writer has been taught, you must go back into your body. You can't, succeed without that. So at that point on, from then on, she wrote with the body front and center, and it was a body in pain. And she'd always written bodies front and center. They were just exuberant, desiring sexual bodies, or bodies with poo and snot and dirty nappies and all these things. She was obsessed with this, being able to name the functions of the body. But of course, when she's got a body that's breaking down, what she does is she names that through her stories. And it's arguably why the power of false bread is so great. When you have Rolly, who's losing the feeling in his legs, he loses the ability to ride, to walk. It's a similar kind of trajectory that what she's experiencing.
Yes. And that book, her last novel, was considered, I think is considered by many to be her masterpiece. It's just extraordinary that she wrote it under those difficult circumstances. And it still has the energy and the vibrancy of her horse riding and her love of horses. And you would not know it was written by a woman who was so seriously unwell.
Seriously unwell, and absolutely bound in her wheelchair with horrendous bed sores because she can't move. At one point she's writing and then editing. She can only move one finger, and she's doing that for this novel. It's extraordinary what she achieved.
Yeah, she really does seem to have crammed in as much life and lovers and adventure and travel as she could, almost as though she knew it was going to be cut short.
It's that. Well, she was obsessed with getting older. She wanted to stay in her childhood. She was obsessed from an early age that her childhood was galloping away and she needed to stay there. She was also obsessed with death. But largely it was with other people dying in the early days, when she was 15, 16, 17. It wasn't necessarily about herself dying. But yes, there seems to be some preternatural idea that she just burnt brightly. And all I could think was, I'm so pleased you did all those things. I'm so pleased you had all those lovers, went on those trips, did all these outrageous things. And you burnt out quickly and too soon. But you did live. You really did live.
And of course, she decided to take her own life in the end, very thoughtfully and methodically. She worked towards this and became an advocate for voluntary euthanasia. And great loss, but she did it on her own terms. You've said, of course, that you would have loved to talk to her more. What would you have asked her if you'd been able to interview Gillian?
Oh, I don't know if I would know what I would have asked her, but I would have liked to have talked to her about, I think largely her self-recriminations, her self-hatred. You know, she loved herself in all sorts of ways. She was quite narcissistic in all sorts of ways, but she also was extremely tough on herself. And I think I might have tried to talk to her to say, ease up a bit. You know, we're all very fallible and we all hurt people and we all have good qualities and bad. But I would have liked to have talked to her more about her feelings about herself, about her relationships with people, human nature, those sorts of things.
Do you think that writing after her death in some ways makes it easier for you as her biographer?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. People always used to say that terribly callous line of, you know, the best subject is a dead subject. And I just never really felt it as powerfully as when I came to write this biography. Firstly, I missed not having her there because I'd got so used to having Helen Garner there when I was doing hers, and that absence was terrible. I was worried in the beginning. When I first went to Grafton to meet the family, Peter picked me up from the airport, Peter, her father, and drove me around Grafton and showed me all the significant sites, which was great. And it turned out to be Grafton Show Day. And I went to the showground, and there was Yvonne with Koru, Gillian's horse, and with two young girls, one of whom was wearing Gillian's riding jacket, and they were doing their first dressage. You couldn't have scripted a better introduction to Grafton, to Yvonne, to Gillian, to the Mears family, anything. Later on during the day, we went back to Gillian's house on the hill, which Yvonne now lives in, and Yvonne took me out to Lilydale to swim in the river, but she took me to Gillian's grave. And I was extremely moved. And I also made a promise to her then that I would try and do this. I would try and give some shape to this book, this life. I wasn't sure that I could do it. And I was also a little bit worried that I was so emotional at Gillian's grave that maybe I wasn't capable of being her biographer. I thought, am I too compromised here? Am I too involved? But over the years, that was okay. Although I still feel there was a large element of writing this as a work of respect and honour. And I want to now go back. I've been back to her grave twice, and I now want to go back again and just have a little quiet sit there and say, well, maybe leave a book there and say, I think we did it, Gillian.
Yeah.
Might be a bit sentimental, but
no, do it.
Yeah.
Do it.
I feel it.
You mentioned several works in progress at the end of her life, and she told me about a couple in our interview. She wanted to write another magical fable and another doomed romance. I just wondered if you think there's any unpublished work that should be made public. She has a fable called The Goat and the Plumicorn, which she has written, and I think it's pretty close to finishing. She has given it to Karen, her sister, because she called Karen the midwife for the cat with the coloured tail, and she gave it to Karen and said, could you please see this through? And Karen's daughter Helen is a really talented artist, and she draws all the Moomin Troll characters that Gillian loves so much, and she asked Helen to do the illustrations. I think that would be a wonderful piece to come out, and it may come out. I think the unfinished projects she talked about, the novels and the stories, are very
unformed. So I don't think there's anything there to come out. There's two stories in the archive that have not been published, but they're not good. And she's published over 200 stories, so they don't need to come out. They weren't polished and they weren't good. So I think we have her work. Maybe there's something more on her laptop. Yvonne has her laptop, I don't know. Maybe there's something there. But I think it would be really lovely if The Goat and the Plumicorn came out. That would be a kind of fitting thing. Gillian was obsessed that her cat with the coloured tail was going to change the world. It was going to be the new Little Prince. And it hasn't, but some people say it's a beautiful book. I think it would be a very nice thing if that came out. Vincent Long has taken quite a lot of footage of Gillian, and he has enough to do a small documentary. I think that would be fantastic if that came out. But yeah, I think that's about all at the moment.
You have a beautiful photograph on the cover of the book, which captures her joy and her energy. Sorry, I'm not showing that very well. Could you tell us, it's a beautifully packaged book with some other wonderful photographs inside. Could you tell us what the title means, where it came from, and how you chose the photograph for the cover?
Yeah, okay, let's start with the photograph. So, a biography, you usually need a photograph of the author. And searching, weeks of searching. Gillian was close friends with Sandy Edwards and Robert Macfarlane, Russell Shakespeare, three of the great photographers of Australia. Well, Sandy actually did have a lot of photographs of Gillian, but a lot of them were largely when she was older, or she was definitely not looking at the camera. It's extraordinary. She's mates with these great artists, but she doesn't actually have too many photographs of herself directly looking at the camera. She was often the one behind the camera. We wanted a photograph, I wanted a photograph, and Jane Palfrey wanted a photograph that showed the exuberant, young, gorgeous, alive Gillian. And so we had to go right back. And so then I found quite a few of her sort of sultry looking ones and whatever. And then there was this one taken in 1990. She's 26, there's no MS. She's written underneath it in her album, the Laughing Galah. And it just captured so much that was there. So it was just, that was the photo. It just had to be done. Inside we actually, because this is again Jane Palfrey,
Yes.
I do this, we've got all sorts of beautiful watercolours that Gillian, I've got a virtual background which is coming off.
Maybe I can show.
Yeah, and the Moomin Trolls. Again, just
Terrible.
To show,
how do I do this? There we are.
And to show her creativity, Gillian's creativity, that she was always creating in all sorts of different ways. It wasn't just through words, it was sewing and it was drawing and it was colouring and painting it.
Yeah.
And so they're in there as well.
Yeah.
And then fortunately Jane said, yes, of course you can have 16, a 16-page photograph insert, which sounds very generous, which it was, except that I had about 7,000 photographs to choose from because Gillian kept all these photographs. And so that's how many photographs there are. They tell a story. The photographs are in there. I think we've run out of time, are we? We're almost running out of time.
Yeah, we'll take a couple of questions from the audience. But just tell me where the title of the book comes from.
Okay.
In the book, in her story.
Yes. So in The Grass Sister, we have a character who goes missing in Africa, possibly because she wrote herself out of history by leaping into a waterfall in the Chimanimani Mountains. That's one bit of the reason for the waterfall. The other is a quote which I use as an epigraph, so I'll just find it here, and it's from Gillian's diary in 2000, in May 2000, and I'll just quote this. It's one sentence. Now I understand about the waterfall I kept on dreaming and even writing about. To not go over the terrifying maelstrom of change, to not let go and fall and alter and leave behind the safety of the little upper river shallows is ultimately courting death. So the leaping into waterfalls was her drive all her life to throw herself over the edge of the intensity of experience, whatever that experience might be. The risk, the freedom, and the intensity to, if you stay safe, you're courting death. And going over the waterfall may well result in death, but you've got to do it. You've got to live. And that's where it's from.
Thank you. And that perhaps is what drove her to write as well.
Mm.
You had a question about what drove her to write, and it sounds as though they're all tied together.
Everything, yes, definitely. Do we have a question? Are we questioning?
Yeah, we have a few very good questions. Was there a noticeable spike in correspondence and diary keeping after Gillian's diagnosis, when she knew she was dying, or did she always have a sense of leaving a historical and literary legacy?
Very good question. She always had a sense of leaving the historical legacy. After she had the endocarditis, she wrote a lot of letters to people who had stopped writing to her, old friends, old lovers, and was very angry when some of them didn't respond with enough concern. One of whom was Gerald Murnane.
Gerald Murnane, who she had a fascinating correspondence with.
Huge. There's anyone interested in Gerald Murnane, you've got to read this book because it's fascinating. And she tore strips off him. But no, she didn't, because by the time she was diagnosed with MS and then she's going off in Anton B, she's actually losing the space for all the writing because she's just living in a tiny back of the ambulance, but she's also losing her mobility at that time. So the writing actually becomes, the correspondence becomes actually a huge amount of energy that she just doesn't have. Eventually she gets onto emails, and so she does send emails and then texts using voice recognition. But no, there was probably more correspondence before she was ill.
And another question touches on that. What sort of shift did you notice between digital and print correspondence? Aside from volume, was there a shift in the way she communicated over the years?
Yes, her letters were, anyone will tell you, they were just these thick, juicy novelist letters. That's how Michael Add describes them. Her turn of phrase in her letters is like the turn of phrase in her writing. When she gets to emails and then voice recognition, of course, things lose that kind of lyricism and the poetry. Not always, there's still some beautiful ones there, but by that stage, she's run out of a lot of energy and she's really just corresponding to ask things, to organise things, to be cross at people, to tell them off, those sorts of things. So yes, it's the early letters that are full of absolute beauty.
Another question asks, what's your advice for not losing yourself in the archive and for shaping your book back from the 300,000 word manuscript? I think you said you had enough for 4 volumes.
I did. Yes, I think the answer for not losing yourself in the archive is that you have to remember that your reader has a limited amount of energy. You might be fascinated with your subject, but actually your reader can only really tolerate about 300 pages unless you're going to do some doorstopper thing. So you have to distill the story. What are the key points in this story? How does the story progress? So, and I suppose having many years as an academic and supervising PhD students, I learned that the delete button is your best friend. And so ultimately, again, it's an ego thing. You let your ego go and say, okay, delete it. Just get rid of it. Just, you don't need that. Just tell this story and make the reader want to turn the next page and follow Gillian's life and then get to the end and be extremely moved, which I've heard people are, and to then say, okay, now I've got to go back and find her books. So that's how I didn't lose myself in the archive.
And another question asks how you dealt with her directions. Dear biographer, please include this or pay attention to this. Did you feel obliged to follow her stage directions?
No.
Or resist them?
No, I didn't feel obliged to, but I thought they were fascinating. And I loved putting them in the book to tell people, you know, how she's imagining her biography and what I supposedly look like. And I'm supposedly young and I'm shy and I'm a reinvention of herself. Yeah, sorry, sweetheart, you missed out there. I thought it was fascinating, and it actually messed with my head sometimes because you become so close to your subject and suddenly she's talking to me and I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute, this is not okay. You don't get to do this. But I liked it. I liked her her chutzpah. I like that she thought she'd get away with it.
Mm. Look, I've got such good questions from such interesting people here who I'm not allowed to name, but hello, everyone. It's great to see you there. We're going to run out of time, and there'll be other opportunities to talk to Bernadette and ask more questions in future. Let me see. Oh, goodness. How do you find your first and last sentence? You are a wonderful writer.
Oh, yes. Well, they're essential. The first and last sentence are essential, and they're found very differently. The first sentence, I don't know the answer. It just comes. And when it comes, it's there. And I've got to say, I really like my first sentence on this one. My last one, it just had to end dancing. It had to end with Leonard Cohen. And even though my editor said, no, you can't do that, and you must end with your own voice or Gillian's voice, and you can't do this book, the epilogue wrote itself. It's probably part of my emotion and my sentimentality, but I just thought this is the only way I can end this book, with dancing as Gillian wanted us to dance. So that one was an easy one.
Well, I think that's a very good note to end on.
Thank you.
Bernadette, thank you very much. I just have to say, I could not put this book down, literally, and I know other people are saying the same thing about it. You've done a really monumental and splendid work of autobiography. It's an important book that will be read by literary scholars, by ordinary readers for a long, long time. And the joy is that it will send people back to Gillian's work. And yes. We honour her and say hello, Gillian, here tonight. And thank you, Bernadette. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Thank you, Susan, and everybody else out there. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your time. I think very much like your manuscript, we could have easily filled another hour with a conversation between yourselves and even more questions to come. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Bernadette and Susan, both for your time. To all of our audience at home, the next in our Author Talk series, again online, will be a very timely discussion on reinvention with Catherine Hayman and Jenny Valentish. These two acclaimed authors will join us for an inspirational talk as they discuss the power and potential of reinvention, along with the challenges and strategies needed to dismantle and reinvent. This event is open for registrations on the State Library website and will be held online on the 7th of October at 6:30 p.m. I encourage you all at home to also keep an eye on the State Library website while we are still in lockdown in New South Wales and Sydney. There is so much content constantly happening and changing to keep you all connected while we are still at home. Bernadette, congratulations on a beautiful book. Thank you both so much for your time, and thank you all at home for your time this evening as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.